The black SUV didn't belong in this neighborhood where chain-link fences sagged under their own weight, and asphalt cracked into patterns that resembled dried riverbeds. Its polished surface caught the afternoon sun like a mirror, reflecting the peeling paint of Grace's garage with such clarity that the contrast became almost obscene. The engine's purr was barely audible, a whisper of precision engineering that seemed to mock the rattling compressors and wheezing hydraulic lifts that formed the soundtrack of her daily work. Grace stood in her garage doorway with a wrench still hanging from her oil-stained fingers, watching the vehicle idle at the curb as if its driver was reconsidering this destination. The neighborhood had gone silent in that particular way that meant everyone was watching from behind curtains and half-closed blinds, recognizing expensive trouble even if they couldn't name its specific form. She'd seen luxury cars before, usually driven by people who'd taken a wrong turn and needed directions back to the highway. The driver's door opened with a sound so perfectly engineered it was almost inaudible, and a man emerged who carried himself like he'd never questioned whether a room would make space for him. His suit was charcoal gray, with the kind of subtle sheen that came from fabric most people couldn't pronounce, tailored so precisely it moved with him like a second skin. Everything about him spoke of control, from the measured way he scanned the street to the deliberate pace of his approach. Grace set the wrench on her workbench without taking her eyes off him, muscle memory guiding her hand to the exact spot, while her mind cataloged details with the same diagnostic precision she applied to failing transmissions. His shoes were leather, but not overly polished, expensive enough to signal wealth, but practical enough to suggest someone who occasionally remembered he had feet. The watch on his left wrist caught light for just a moment, revealing complications that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. He stopped 3 feet from her doorway, close enough for conversation but far enough to respect the boundary her posture created, and his eyes met hers with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. Most people looked at her garage and saw poverty or potential, but his gaze suggested he was assessing something entirely different, weighing factors she couldn't begin to guess. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the slight rasp of someone who'd spent years issuing orders that were never questioned. "You're Grace Romano." It wasn't phrased as a question, though the statement somehow demanded confirmation through its certainty. His accent placed him as Chicago-born, but educated somewhere that had filed down the roughest edges without erasing them completely. The mechanic who rebuilt Antonio Russo's 1967 Alfa Romeo using parts you fabricated yourself because the originals don't exist anymore. She nodded slowly, wondering how this man knew about a job she'd completed 8 months ago for a regular customer who collected vintage cars in his retirement. Antonio had cried when he'd seen the finished restoration, but he wasn't the type to spread word beyond his circle of fellow enthusiasts. The fact that this stranger knew suggested research conducted with resources beyond simple internet searching. That's impressive work for someone operating out of a garage that looks like it might collapse in a strong wind. His observation lacked condescension, delivered instead with the flat assessment of someone stating objective facts. "Antonio showed me photographs of the fabrication process, the way you hand-formed components that factories required specialized machinery to produce." He paused, and something shifted in his expression that might have been vulnerability in someone less practiced at concealment. The passenger door opened then, and Grace's attention shifted to the young woman who emerged with movements so careful they seemed choreographed for maximum efficiency. She was 19 or 20, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized delicate features marked by the particular exhaustion that came from managing constant discomfort. Her dress was modest and well-made, but what drew Grace's eye were the metal orthoses visible from mid-calf down to specially designed shoes. The devices were clearly expensive, constructed from titanium or some similar alloy with precision joints that caught sunlight, as the young woman took 3 measured steps away from the vehicle. But Grace's trained eye immediately identified the fundamental design flaw in the ankle articulation, the way the joint forced compensation that would create stress patterns up through the knee and hip. Whoever had built these had prioritized appearance over function, creating something that looked medically sophisticated while failing at its primary purpose. The man's hand moved instinctively toward the young woman but stopped halfway, a gesture of protection arrested by visible effort. "My daughter, Victoria," he said, and those 2 words contained volumes about power rendered irrelevant by circumstance. "She's been wearing those devices for 4 years, fitted by specialists in Boston, New York, and Zurich, who all assured me they represented the pinnacle of orthotic engineering." Victoria reached them with movements that demonstrated both determination and the careful calculation of someone who'd learned to budget energy across each day's required activities. Up close, Grace could see the slight asymmetry in her gait, the microscopic hesitation before each step that suggested pain managed rather than eliminated. Her eyes were steady, despite obvious fatigue, intelligent and observant in ways that medical professionals probably dismissed while focusing on her diagnosis. "I can walk," Victoria said, her voice quiet but clear, addressing Grace directly rather than allowing her father to speak for her. "But it feels like I'm fighting the equipment instead of being helped by it. Like every step requires convincing these devices to cooperate with what my body wants to do." She shifted her weight slightly, and Grace heard the faint metallic complaint of joints that weren't quite aligned with human biomechanics. Grace found herself analyzing the problem before consciously deciding to engage, her mind already breaking down the stress points and calculating alternative approaches to weight distribution and articulation. The orthoses were over-engineered in some ways, and criminally simplistic in others, designed by people who understood materials, but not the lived reality of bodies that needed to negotiate stairs, uneven sidewalks, and the 1,000 small adjustments required for actual human movement. She could see at least 6 modifications that would improve function without requiring exotic materials or complex machinery. "Those ankle joints are forcing you into a walking pattern that's probably creating problems higher up," Grace said, speaking directly to Victoria rather than her father. "The pivot point is too far forward, which means you're overcompensating with your knees every time you push off, and I'm guessing your lower back aches by afternoon from the cumulative stress of thousands of slightly wrong movements." Victoria's expression shifted from polite attention to something sharper, recognition lighting her features as if someone had finally described her exact experience after years of being told her discomfort was imaginary or inevitable. "The specialist said I needed to strengthen my core and adjust to the equipment's requirements," she said, and Grace heard the weight of dismissals delivered with medical authority behind those words. "They never suggested the equipment might need adjusting to me." The man, whom Grace was beginning to suspect was more than just wealthy, turned to look at his daughter with an expression that suggested he was hearing this complaint articulated clearly for the first time. His jaw tightened in a way that made Grace suddenly very aware that this was someone accustomed to solving problems through application of resources or pressure. But some problems couldn't be threatened or purchased into submission, which appeared to be a lesson he was still learning. "Can you fix them?" The question came from him, but his eyes moved to Victoria as he asked it, seeking permission, or perhaps forgiveness for hoping again after what must have been numerous disappointments. "Not adjust or optimize, but actually fix them so my daughter can walk without pain, the way those specialists promised and failed to deliver despite charging fees that could fund a small hospital?" Grace looked at the orthoses again, then at her garage with its collection of salvaged tools and improvised equipment that represented 15 years of solving problems through ingenuity rather than resources. She thought about Antonio's Alfa Romeo, about the engine block she'd repaired last month for a single mother's minivan, using techniques she'd invented because the official service manual assumed access to tools she couldn't afford. Every successful repair had started with someone else's failure, and her willingness to approach the problem from an angle that disrespected conventional wisdom. "I'd need to take measurements and understand exactly how Victoria moves, not how medical charts say she should move," Grace said, already mentally inventorying which tools she'd need and which techniques would translate from automotive work to human biomechanics. The specialists who built those probably worked from scans and theoretical models, but metal doesn't care about theory, it only responds to actual force and stress patterns. She gestured toward her workspace, where an engine block sat partially disassembled, each component laid out with surgical precision on clean shop towels. The man's eyes narrowed slightly, assessment shifting into something that might have been skepticism, or the particular caution of someone who'd been disappointed by confident promises before. "You're comparing my daughter's medical equipment to car parts," he said, and Grace couldn't quite read whether that was objection or observation. His hand moved to his jacket's inner pocket, a gesture so automatic it seemed unconscious, though he stopped before actually reaching for whatever he kept there. "I'm saying that both require understanding how components interact under real-world stress rather than controlled conditions," Grace replied, meeting his gaze without the deference he probably expected from someone whose entire business occupied less space than his vehicle. "An engine can pass every diagnostic test in the shop, but fail on the highway because manuals don't account for how actual drivers accelerate or the specific grade of hills in their commute." She pointed at Victoria's orthoses, where sunlight revealed wear patterns on the metal that told stories of compensatory movements. Those devices were built for a theoretical patient, not for her. Victoria had moved closer to the workbench during this exchange, her attention caught by the organized chaos of Grace's diagnostic process. The engine components were labeled with handwritten tags that noted not just part names, but specific observations about wear patterns and stress fractures. "You document everything," Victoria said, picking up one of the tags with careful fingers that suggested she understood the importance of not disturbing someone else's organizational system. "Like you're learning from each problem instead of just fixing it and moving on." "Every failure teaches you something if you pay attention," Grace said, appreciating that Victoria had noticed a detail most people missed. That valve cover cracked because the owner's son was revving the engine cold every morning, creating thermal stress that standard maintenance schedules don't anticipate. She retrieved a battered notebook from the workbench's single drawer, its pages filled with sketches and calculations that represented her real education. "I started keeping records after I rebuilt a carburetor perfectly, according to specifications, but it still ran rough because the manual assumed sea-level air pressure, and I'm working in Chicago." The man reached into his jacket again, this time completing the motion to withdraw a leather wallet that probably cost more than Grace's best toolbox. "I should clarify who I am before we continue this conversation," he said, extracting a business card with the slow deliberation of someone handling a weapon. "My name is Matteo De Luca, and I'm aware that my reputation might precede me in certain circles." He extended the card, which Grace accepted with grease-stained fingers that left slight smudges on its pristine surface. The card identified him as CEO of De Luca Capital Holdings, which Grace recognized as one of those corporate entities that appeared in news articles about real estate development and business acquisitions. But the way he'd phrased his introduction, the careful specificity of certain circles, suggested activities beyond what got printed in the business section. She'd grown up in this neighborhood, had learned to recognize the particular kind of power that operated through phone calls rather than contracts, and suddenly the expensive car and the aura of controlled danger made different sense. "I don't care about your reputation," Grace said, setting the card on her workbench without reading the details. "I care whether I can help Victoria walk without pain, and whether you're going to interfere with my process because you're used to controlling outcomes through money or pressure." She crossed her arms, aware that this was probably the first time in years someone had spoken to Matteo De Luca with anything approaching directness. "I've seen what happens when wealthy people try to rush craftsmanship, and I won't compromise the work because you're impatient or because you think funding the project means you get to dictate methodology." Something flickered across Matteo's face that might have been surprise or possibly the beginning of respect, though his expression settled back into controlled neutrality so quickly Grace couldn't be certain. "The specialists we've consulted have included some of the most prominent orthopedic engineers in the world," he said, his voice carrying the particular edge of someone defending decisions against implied criticism. "They had access to diagnostic equipment worth more than this entire block, and teams of researchers supporting their work." He paused, and the silence stretched long enough to become pointed. "You're suggesting they all failed where you, working alone in a garage that looks like it violates multiple safety codes, might succeed." "I'm suggesting they failed because they were solving the problem they understood rather than the problem Victoria actually has," Grace replied, unfazed by the challenge in his tone. "They built what their training and equipment told them was correct, but correct according to medical engineering principles isn't the same as correct for the specific person who has to live with the results." She moved to her workbench and retrieved a small metal bracket she'd fabricated the previous week for a customer's suspension repair. Standard part would have worked fine according to specifications, but this customer drives on streets where potholes are deep enough to swallow small children, so I modified the design to handle impacts the manufacturer never anticipated. Victoria had been watching this exchange with an expression Grace couldn't quite interpret, something between hope and the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to invest too heavily in potential solutions. "May I ask a question?" she said, directing her words to Grace, but glancing at her father as if seeking permission through habit rather than necessity. Her hands had moved to touch the orthoses at her ankles, fingers tracing the metal with the unconscious familiarity of someone who'd mapped every centimeter through years of constant contact. "You don't need to ask permission to ask questions," Grace said gently, recognizing the dynamic she'd observed between Matteo's protective instincts and Victoria's carefully cultivated independence. "If I'm going to work on equipment that affects your daily life, you have more right to interrogate my process than anyone else in this conversation." She pulled out a stool from beneath the workbench, offering it to Victoria with a gesture that suggested sitting was an option rather than a weakness. Victoria settled onto the stool with visible relief, a small acknowledgement that standing required more energy than she wanted to expend during extended conversation. The specialists always explained what they were going to do in terms I didn't really understand. Lots of technical language about biomechanical leverage and orthotic intervention protocols, she said, her words coming faster now as if releasing something long held back. Then they'd hand me the new devices and tell me to wear them for 6 weeks while my body adjusted. But it never felt like adjustment, just like management of a different kind of pain. She looked directly at Grace with eyes that demanded honesty rather than comfort. If you modify these, how will I know whether it's actually better or whether I'm just experiencing the temporary relief of change before settling into a new version of the same problems? The question demonstrated the kind of critical thinking that medical professionals probably found inconvenient in patients, the refusal to accept expert authority without evidence. Grace appreciated the skepticism because it suggested Victoria understood the difference between hope and realism. "We'll document your current movement patterns first," Grace said, already planning the assessment process. "I'll record how you walk, where the stress points are, what compensations you're making, so we have baseline data rather than subjective memory." She gestured toward the notebook on her workbench. "Then we'll make small modifications and test each one before proceeding to the next, so you can identify exactly what changes and whether those changes represent actual improvement or just novelty." Matteo had been silent during this exchange, his attention moving between Grace and his daughter, with the alertness of someone monitoring a situation for potential threats or disappointments. "You haven't asked about payment," he said finally, the statement carrying undertones of suspicion, as if Grace's failure to discuss fees suggested either stupidity or a different kind of trap. "The specialists we've consulted charged retainers that would cover your operating costs for a year, and they had facilities with staff and equipment that justified those fees." His hand moved again toward his wallet, the gesture almost reflexive. "What's your price for this work?" "I don't know yet, because I haven't assessed the full scope of what needs to be done," Grace replied, which was true, but also a strategic deflection of a conversation she sensed would become complicated. "I charge for materials and time at rates that let me keep this garage operating without taking advantage of people who are already dealing with enough difficulties." She met his gaze steadily, aware that honesty might be novel enough to be either refreshing or suspicious. "If I can't help Victoria, I won't charge you anything except maybe materials I can't return, and if I can help, we'll discuss fair compensation after you've seen results rather than paying up front for promises." The offer seemed to unsettle Matteo more than if she'd named an exorbitant price, his expression shifting through several configurations before settling on wary confusion. People in his world probably operated through contracts and leverage, everything negotiated and formalized before work began. Grace's willingness to proceed on good faith must have seemed either admirably naive or suspiciously calculated, a potential trap whose mechanism he couldn't quite identify. His fingers drummed once against his thigh, a small breach in his controlled demeanor that suggested internal debate about whether to walk away from something that defied his understanding of how transactions worked. "My father isn't used to people who don't want something from him," Victoria said quietly, speaking to Grace but clearly intending her father to hear. "Usually by this point in a conversation, someone has asked for a donation to their clinic or mentioned a research grant they're pursuing, or at least hinted that knowing him could be professionally beneficial." There was no accusation in her voice, just the tired observation of someone who'd watched this pattern repeat throughout her life. It makes him suspicious when someone treats him like a regular person instead of an opportunity. Grace's garage underwent a metamorphosis over the following week that happened in increments small enough that each individual change seemed insignificant until the accumulated effect became undeniable. The engine block that had occupied her primary workbench got moved to a corner where it sat covered with clean canvas, its repair postponed but not abandoned. In its place, Grace assembled tools borrowed from 3 different contacts: a jeweler's precision caliper set, a metalworking vise designed for small components, and a heat gun with temperature control accurate to within 5 degrees that belonged to an artist who shaped metal sculptures in a studio across town. She'd spent 2 full days just watching Victoria move, not in the clinical way of medical professionals with their gait analysis software and force plate measurements, but with the diagnostic attention she applied to engines revealing their problems through subtle vibrations and irregular sounds. Victoria walked back and forth across the garage floor while Grace observed from different angles, noting how the orthoses forced her weight onto the outer edges of her feet, and how she shortened her right stride by approximately 2 inches to avoid triggering sharp pain that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. The asymmetry cascaded upward through her posture, creating a slight rotation in her hips that probably went unnoticed by everyone except people trained to see mechanical stress patterns. On the third day, Grace had Victoria stand still while she measured and photographed the orthoses from every angle, her hands moving over the metal with the same careful attention she'd give to a cracked engine block that might shatter under pressure. The devices were beautifully crafted in their way, precision machined from titanium alloy, with joints that moved smoothly through their designed range of motion. But designed range and necessary range diverged in critical ways, particularly at the ankle where the dorsiflexion was limited to 15 degrees when Victoria's natural walking pattern required closer to 22 degrees, based on Grace's observations. That 7-degree deficit forced compensations that rippled through every step like a misaligned wheel, creating vibration that destroyed suspension components over time. Victoria participated in this assessment process with an attentiveness that suggested she was memorizing every detail, asking questions about what Grace was measuring and why each angle mattered. She'd brought a notebook of her own on the second day, recording observations that Grace hadn't explicitly stated, but that demonstrated Victoria was learning to see her own body as a mechanical system with specific requirements. "The pain in my lower back gets worse after I've been walking on concrete versus carpet," Victoria mentioned during one measurement session, making a connection between surface compliance and stress distribution that medical professionals had apparently never explored with her. Grace had requested that Matteo not attend these initial sessions, explaining that his presence created a dynamic that would interfere with the work's necessary intimacy. He'd agreed with visible reluctance, demonstrating the particular restraint of someone accustomed to controlling situations through proximity and observation. Instead, he sent Marco, a quiet man in his 40s, who positioned himself near the garage entrance and watched everything with the professional awareness of someone trained to identify threats before they materialized. Marco never spoke unless directly addressed, but his presence was a constant reminder that Victoria's life existed within contexts Grace could only partially imagine. The actual modification work began on day 6, after Grace had spent hours sketching redesigns that filled 3 pages of her notebook with calculations and crossed out approaches that didn't solve the fundamental problem. She'd decided to start with the right ankle joint, replacing the factory pivot mechanism with something she'd fabricate herself from components that included parts borrowed from a precision door hinge, elements of a bicycle's rear derailleur, and steel stock she'd shape using techniques developed for repairing stress fractures in engine components. The design looked crude in her sketches compared to the machined perfection of the original, but it would allow movement through a fuller range while distributing stress more evenly across the joint's attachment points. Victoria arrived each afternoon after her morning college classes, which Grace learned she attended remotely to avoid the complications of navigating campus with her current equipment. She'd park herself on the stool Grace had designated as hers, and watch the fabrication process with questions that evolved from curious to technical as the days progressed. "Why are you using 3 smaller screws instead of 1 larger bolt?" Victoria asked, while Grace was assembling the new pivot mechanism, and the question demonstrated she was beginning to understand that engineering involved trade-offs between strength, weight, and the ability to make future adjustments without replacing entire components. "Larger bolt would be stronger in terms of shear force resistance," Grace explained, pausing to show Victoria the difference in her hands. "But it would create a single point of failure and make the joint harder to adjust if we need to modify the tension after you've tested it for a few days." She threaded the first screw carefully, demonstrating the technique before handing Victoria the screwdriver. "Also, 3 points of attachment distribute the stress more evenly, which matters because your ankle is going to be putting lateral force on this joint every time you push off during a step, not just the vertical load that a single bolt would handle efficiently." Victoria's hands shook slightly as she positioned the screwdriver, not from fear, but from the concentration of someone attempting an unfamiliar task that carried emotional weight beyond its technical requirements. She managed the first screw competently after 2 false starts, and Grace saw something shift in her expression, a small pride in demonstrating capability beyond the narrow role of patient, waiting for experts to solve her problems. The second screw went faster, Victoria's confidence building with each successful turn until the mechanism was assembled through effort she could claim as partially her own. The installation required removing Victoria's right orthosis completely, which meant she had to sit with her leg extended while Grace worked, the asymmetry of 1 bare foot and 1 still braced creating vulnerability that Victoria managed with determined composure. Grace had expected the skin beneath to be marked by pressure points and irritation, But Victoria's care routines had apparently prevented the worst damage, even if they couldn't eliminate discomfort. The flesh showed the subtle indentations of long-term compression, a topographical map of where the device had pressed against her body for years, reshaping her through constant contact. Fitting the modified joint required precision that had Grace working for 90 focused minutes without pause, aware that misalignment of even a millimeter could transform improvement into new injury. She'd fabricated custom attachment brackets that would distribute pressure more broadly than the original design's narrow contact points, using techniques she'd developed for mounting aftermarket parts to vehicles whose frames weren't designed to accommodate them. Victoria watched the process in silence, broken only by occasional questions, and Grace appreciated that she didn't fill the space with nervous conversation or apologies for taking up time. When Grace finally secured the last connection and carefully flexed Victoria's ankle through its range of motion, the joint moved with a smoothness that the original equipment had never achieved despite its expensive precision. The modification added approximately 3 ounces to the overall weight, but the improved biomechanical efficiency should more than compensate for that minor increase. The real test is how it performs under load, Grace said, offering her hand to help Victoria stand. We'll start with just standing and shifting weight. See how it feels compared to your left side. Then progress to walking only after you're confident the joint is responding predictably. Victoria gripped Grace's hand with surprising strength and rose carefully, her expression cycling through concentration, surprise, and something that might have been cautious hope as she settled her weight onto both feet. It feels different, she said after a moment, and Grace heard the effort to describe sensory experience that didn't map to familiar categories. Not necessarily better or worse yet, just different in a way that doesn't immediately hurt, which is unusual enough to be disconcerting. She shifted her weight from left to right and back, micro-movements that tested the new joint's response to force from various angles. Grace watched the modified ankle's behavior with the same focused attention she'd give to a rebuilt engine during its first test run, looking for unexpected stress points or movement patterns that suggested her calculations had missed something important. The joint articulated through Victoria's weight shifts, without the slight catch that had characterized the original, moving through its range with fluid efficiency that suggested the additional degrees of freedom were being utilized naturally. Try lifting your right heel while keeping your toes on the ground, Grace instructed, wanting to test the dorsiflexion that had been limited before. Don't force it. Just see how far the movement wants to go without resistance from the equipment. Victoria's heel lifted smoothly through an arc that would have been impossible with the original joint configuration, her ankle flexing to perhaps 20 degrees before she stopped the motion voluntarily, rather than hitting mechanical limits. The surprise on her face was immediately replaced by something fiercer, an expression Grace recognized from her own mirror after successfully completing a repair that everyone else had deemed impossible. I haven't been able to do that in 4 years, Victoria said quietly, repeating the movement as if confirming it wasn't a fluke or her imagination. The other orthoses would stop me at about half that range, and pushing against that limit was where most of the pain originated. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Grace cautioned, though she felt her own pulse quickening with the possibility that her approach might actually work. That's one movement in a controlled environment with me standing right here to catch you, if the joint fails unexpectedly. She gestured toward the length of the garage. I want you to take 5 steps, slow and deliberate, focusing on how the modified side feels compared to your left. Then we'll reassess and decide whether to proceed with modifying the other ankle, or if we need to refine this one further first. Victoria nodded and took her first step with the modified orthosis, her right foot rolling through heel strike to toe off with a fluidity that the original equipment had never permitted, and Grace saw the exact moment when Victoria registered that the expected pain at push-off simply didn't arrive as anticipated. The second step came with slightly more confidence, the third with enough trust in the modification that her gait began to equalize between right and left sides. By the 5th step, tears were streaming down Victoria's face, though her expression remained focused on the technical task of walking, as if acknowledging the emotional dimension would break whatever spell had made this improvement possible. Marco called Matteo immediately, his voice carrying urgency that cut through whatever meeting the call interrupted, and within 20 minutes the black SUV returned with speed suggesting traffic laws were negotiable. Matteo emerged before his driver fully stopped, controlled demeanor fracturing to reveal the father beneath calculated authority. He froze when he saw Victoria walking toward the workbench, her gait fundamentally altered from the labored pattern he'd witnessed for years. Victoria completed her circuit and turned to face her father, and Grace watched recognition dawn across Mateo's features as he processed what the modification had accomplished. His hand rose toward his face in a gesture that might have become covering his mouth, but he arrested the movement and let his arm drop. The silence stretched 5 full seconds before he spoke, his voice rougher than before, stripped of usual control. "Show me again," Mateo said, emerging as request rather than command, a reversal of the dynamic that probably characterized most interactions. Victoria obliged without comment, walking the garage length while her father tracked every step, like memorizing footage to confirm this wasn't imagination. When she reached the far wall and pivoted, her right ankle flexed through the turn with freedom that made the left side's limitations newly obvious. Mateo's attention shifted to Grace with intensity that felt like interrogation lighting, his assessment no longer skeptical, but hungry for understanding. "You modified one ankle in less than a week," he said, the statement carrying implications about specialists who'd consumed months producing failed equipment. His jaw worked silently, processing anger at wasted time that couldn't be recovered regardless of money. "The modification works because it addresses Victoria's specific biomechanics rather than theoretical averages," Grace replied, sensing Mateo needed technical explanation to anchor overwhelming emotions. "Her dorsiflexion requirement exceeds the standard range most orthotic devices accommodate, and the original pivot point was positioned for different proportions." She gestured toward her sketches and calculations, offering transparency medical professionals had apparently never provided. Victoria sat on her stool to rest, and Grace noticed she wasn't favoring her unmodified side, the way she had during previous visits. The improved right ankle had redistributed stress patterns enough that even the unchanged left side experienced relief from compensatory burden. "My hip feels different," Victoria observed, her hand moving to her left side where chronic tension had apparently become so normalized she'd stopped mentioning it. "That's the compensation cascade reversing," Grace explained, crouching to examine how Victoria's posture had shifted with one corrected foundation point. "Your body was twisting to accommodate the right ankle's limitations, which created tension up through your hip and lower back." She traced an invisible line from ankle to hip, making the connection visible. "Now that the right side can move properly, your left side doesn't have to overcompensate." Mateo watched this explanation with the focus of someone cataloging every detail for later analysis, his business acumen apparently translating into ability to absorb technical information. "How long before you can modify the left ankle?" he asked, and Grace heard both hope and the familiar impatience of someone accustomed to accelerating timelines through resource application. His fingers drummed against his thigh, that small tell of controlled anxiety she'd noticed before. "I need to see how Victoria's body adapts to the right side modification before changing the left," Grace said, refusing to be rushed despite understanding his urgency. Her gait is already adjusting, which means her muscle patterns and weight distribution are shifting in ways that will affect what the left ankle needs. She met his gaze steadily. Modifying both simultaneously would have been guessing at solutions rather than responding to observed requirements. Victoria nodded at this explanation, demonstrating the trust she'd developed in Grace's methodical approach over the week's assessment and modification process. The specialists always wanted to do both sides at once, because it was more efficient for their schedule, she said quietly, offering context that explained why previous attempts had failed. "They never suggested that my body might need different things at different times based on how I was actually moving." The comment landed on Mateo like physical weight, his expression cycling through emotions too quickly for Grace to identify individual components. He'd spent what must have been hundreds of thousands of dollars on specialists who'd prioritized their own convenience over his daughter's outcomes. The realization seemed to be reshaping his understanding of how power and money related to actual results in real time. "What do you need from me?" Mateo asked Grace directly, and the question carried undertones of someone attempting to regain some control over a situation that had escaped his usual parameters. Equipment, materials, access to anything that would accelerate the process without compromising quality. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket where his wallet presumably resided, that automatic gesture of someone whose first instinct was throwing resources at problems. Grace considered the offer carefully, recognizing that refusing all assistance might be pride rather than principle, but accepting wrong kinds of help could undermine the work's integrity. "I need Victoria here every day for the next week so I can observe how her gait evolves with the modified ankle," she said finally, establishing terms that centered the work rather than his money. "And I need you to not send specialists or doctors to evaluate my modifications until Victoria and I both agree the work is complete." The second requirement clearly caught Mateo off guard, his eyebrows rising slightly before his expression settled back into neutrality. "You don't want expert validation of your work?" he asked, genuine confusion breaking through his careful control for a moment. The concept of someone rejecting credentialing opportunities apparently didn't fit his model of how ambition operated in the world he knew. "I want Victoria's experience to validate the work," Grace corrected, gesturing toward where Victoria sat watching this negotiation with quiet attention. "Expert opinions matter when you're working from theory, but we're working from observed reality, which means Victoria's body will tell us whether the modifications succeed better than any specialist's assessment could." She paused. "After we're done, you can bring in whoever you want to examine the results, but not during the process." Matteo looked at his daughter, some silent communication passing between them that Grace couldn't fully interpret, but that seemed to involve Victoria's approval of these terms. Whatever he saw in her expression apparently satisfied him because he nodded once, decisive. "Every day for the next week," he confirmed, committing to parameters he couldn't control. "Marco will drive her and wait, but he won't interfere unless there's a safety concern." Victoria returned the following afternoon with a backpack containing her laptop and textbooks, having apparently decided that if she needed to spend hours at the garage daily, she'd combine the time with her remote coursework. She settled onto her stool and opened an engineering textbook that Grace recognized from her own abbreviated attempt at community college 15 years prior. "Biomechanics and Human Motion," Victoria said when she noticed Grace's recognition. "I'm taking it as an elective even though it's not required for my computer science major." "You're studying the theory behind what we're doing practically," Grace observed, appreciating the parallel approach to understanding that combined abstract principles with hands-on application. "That textbook probably has charts showing the standard ranges of motion we've been exceeding with your modification." She wiped her hands on a shop rag and moved closer to see which chapter Victoria had opened. The page showed diagrams of ankle joints with angles marked in degrees, the kind of standardized anatomical illustration that medical device manufacturers probably used when designing orthotic equipment. Victoria's finger traced one particular diagram, her brow furrowed in concentration. "According to this, the ankle should dorsiflex between 10 and 20 degrees during normal walking," she read aloud. "But you measured mine at 22 degrees, which this chart would classify as hypermobile or pathological." "That chart shows averages derived from large population studies," Grace said, settling against the workbench beside Victoria to examine the textbook more closely. "It's useful for understanding general principles, but it can't account for individual variation that falls outside the standard deviation." She pointed at the footnote beneath the diagram. "See where it says normal range with an asterisk? That asterisk is doing a lot of work hiding the fact that normal is statistical construct rather than biological imperative." Victoria's expression shifted as she absorbed this distinction, her education in computer science apparently having prepared her to understand how data modeling worked and where it failed. "So the specialist built my orthoses to accommodate the textbook average rather than measuring what my specific body actually needed," she said, translating the abstract concept into her concrete experience. "They were optimizing for the wrong variable because they assumed the chart defined correct rather than just described typical." "Exactly," Grace confirmed, pleased that Victoria was developing framework for understanding why her approach succeeded where expensive specialists had failed. "Your body isn't wrong for needing 22 degrees of dorsiflexion. The equipment was wrong for limiting you to 15, because that's what the standard called for." She paused, considering how to articulate the deeper principle. "Medicine and engineering both love standards because they make manufacturing and treatment protocols scalable. But individual human bodies didn't read the manual before deciding how they needed to move." Over the following days, Victoria's presence in the garage transformed from patient observation to active participation in ways that surprised both of them. She asked if she could help organize Grace's component inventory, then spent an entire afternoon creating a cataloging system that used principles from database design to track parts by type, size, and source. The resulting organization made Grace's workspace noticeably more efficient, while giving Victoria tangible contribution to the project beyond being its subject. Grace began explaining her thinking process out loud, while fabricating the left ankle modification, treating Victoria as collaborator rather than audience in ways that acknowledged her growing technical understanding. "I'm using slightly different alloy composition for your left side because we've learned from the right side's performance," Grace said, while heating metal for forming. "The right ankle joint handled lateral stress better than I expected, which means I can reduce material thickness here by 0.5 millimeters without compromising strength, making the overall device lighter. Victoria recorded these explanations in her notebook, alongside sketches that showed she was beginning to visualize mechanical systems with developing sophistication. She'd started bringing questions from her biomechanics textbook that related to what Grace was doing, creating dialogue between theoretical knowledge and practical application. The book says that reducing device weight, by even small amounts, can significantly decrease energy expenditure over thousands of daily steps, Victoria mentioned during one session. Is that why you're optimizing for lightness even though the difference is less than an ounce? Exactly that reason, Grace confirmed, appreciating how Victoria was connecting classroom concepts to lived reality in ways her professors probably never intended. An ounce doesn't sound significant until you multiply it by 5,000 steps per day over years of use. She held up the thinned metal piece, light catching its surface. This small optimization might save you the equivalent of carrying an extra pound all day, which translates to less fatigue and lower stress on your joints. The left ankle modification proceeded faster than the right had, Grace's confidence bolstered by proven approach, and Victoria's involvement accelerating certain tasks through her organizational improvements. But Grace maintained the same methodical care, refusing to rush steps that required precision, even as Matteo's daily phone calls to Marco suggested growing impatience with the timeline. Victoria apparently intercepted these calls on the fourth day, because Marco's phone stayed silent afterward, and Matteo didn't appear at the garage until Grace sent word through Victoria that the work was complete. The morning Grace finished the left ankle modification, she arrived at the garage 2 hours before Victoria's usual time to test every joint and connection point under stress conditions that simulated walking forces. She'd fabricated a simple rig from weighted springs that let her cycle the ankle through flexion thousands of times, while monitoring for stress fractures or connection failures that might not appear during initial installation. The device passed every test, but Grace's stomach still churned with anxiety about the difference between mechanical success and human outcome. Victoria arrived at her scheduled time to find Grace sitting on the floor beside both completed orthoses, which gleamed under the garage's fluorescent lights like sculpture rather than medical equipment. The modifications had transformed the devices from purely functional medical apparatus into something that balanced engineering precision with almost artistic attention to how form related to purpose. Every curve served biomechanical function, but the overall effect suggested care beyond mere technical competence. "They're beautiful," Victoria said quietly, crouching beside Grace to examine the devices with hands that trembled slightly, despite obvious effort at control. Her fingers traced the new ankle joints, feeling the smooth articulation that replaced the original's mechanical resistance. The specialist versions always look like medical equipment trying to hide what they were, but these look like they're supposed to exist exactly as they are. Grace hadn't considered aesthetics during the modification process, focused entirely on function, but Victoria's observation made her see the devices differently. "I suppose I built them the way I approach engine rebuilds," she said, picking up the right orthosis to examine it with fresh perspective. "There's no point hiding what something is, so you might as well make the engineering visible and let the quality of work speak for itself rather than disguising it." The philosophy seemed to resonate with Victoria, who nodded slowly while continuing her tactile exploration of the modifications. "The specialists always apologized for how the devices looked, like they were embarrassed I had to wear visible equipment," she said, old frustration bleeding through her usual measured tone. "They kept promising newer versions would be more discreet, as if the problem was other people seeing them rather than the devices not working properly. People who focus on hiding something usually aren't confident it works well enough to withstand examination," Grace observed, articulating a principle she'd developed over years of standing behind her repairs. She met Victoria's gaze directly. "These modifications will be visible, and anyone who knows anything about biomechanics will be able to see exactly how they function, which means the work needs to be good enough to survive scrutiny rather than hidden behind cosmetic covers." Victoria's expression shifted into something fierce and determined, the careful neutrality she usually maintained burning away, to reveal the person underneath who'd spent years being told to accept and accommodate, rather than demand better. "I want to try them," she said, the statement carrying weight of decision that went beyond simply testing equipment. Both sides together, the way you designed them to work as a complete system, rather than isolated modifications. Grace had planned a more gradual approach, letting Victoria adapt to the left side modification before attempting bilateral function. But she recognized the look of someone who needed to know immediately rather than enduring Yanchang uncertainty. We'll do it carefully, she said, retrieving the devices and gesturing for Victoria to sit on the padded bench Grace had borrowed specifically for this moment. I'll help you with the initial fitting, and we'll test standing before attempting any steps. Removing Victoria's old orthoses revealed skin that had adapted to years of pressure, subtle grooves and calluses that mapped where the original devices had pressed against flesh daily. Grace worked with gentle efficiency, fitting the modified equipment with attention to every pressure point and connection, adjusting straps with the same care she'd give to timing a high-performance engine. Victoria's breathing had gone shallow and rapid, controlled terror of disappointment warring with hope she was clearly trying not to fully embrace. The right side went on first, familiar now from a week of wear, and Victoria's ankle immediately settled into the joint's range with visible relief. The left side followed, and Grace watched Victoria's expression cycle through uncertainty, surprise, and cautious recognition as her foot found the same freedom of movement her right had been enjoying. They feel balanced, Victoria said after a moment, wonder creeping into her voice despite obvious effort to maintain clinical assessment. Like my body doesn't have to choose between two different realities anymore. Grace finished the final strap adjustment and sat back on her heels, giving Victoria space to process the sensory experience of having both ankles function within their natural requirements for the first time in 4 years. The moment stretched, filled only with garage sounds of distant traffic and fluorescent lights humming, while Victoria simply sat with her feet flat on the floor and flexed both ankles through their range. The movements were small, almost tentative, but Grace could see they were testing limits that didn't arrive when expected. "Ready to stand?" Grace asked, offering her hands for support, while positioning herself to catch Victoria if the modifications failed catastrophically in ways testing hadn't predicted. Her heart hammered against her ribs, with the peculiar terror of having built something that another human would trust with their body's weight. Every calculation, every fabrication choice, every welded joint now faced the ultimate validation of reality against theory. Victoria gripped Grace's hands with strength that spoke to both determination and fear, and rose slowly from the bench with weight, transferring gradually onto the modified orthoses. Grace felt the moment Victoria's full weight settled onto both feet, watched her eyes widen as the expected pain or instability simply didn't manifest. "Oh," Victoria breathed, the single syllable containing years of bracing for discomfort that had become so normalized its absence felt shocking. "How does it feel?" Grace asked, maintaining hand contact, while Victoria found her balance through micro-adjustments that the new ankle joints accommodated without resistance. She watched for signs of stress or misalignment, every sense attuned to catching problems before they progressed beyond the correctable stage. The joints articulated smoothly through Victoria's balance shifts, metal moving with flesh in harmony rather than conflict. "It feels like standing shouldn't require this much concentration," Victoria said, and Grace heard the cognitive dissonance of someone whose baseline experience was being rewritten in real time. "I keep waiting for the pain to start, for something to catch or pinch, but it's just not happening." She released Grace's hands tentatively, testing whether she could maintain balance independently, and stood unassisted for the first time with properly functioning equipment. Grace stepped back 2 feet, giving Victoria space while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary, and watched her simply stand there processing the experience of having a body that cooperated with her intentions. Tears had started tracking down Victoria's face again, silent and apparently unconscious, her attention fully absorbed by the novel sensation of standing without fighting her equipment. The moment felt too intimate for Grace to witness, but too significant to look away from. "I want to walk," Victoria said, after perhaps 30 seconds of standing, her voice carrying the particular determination of someone who'd decided to push through fear rather than give it space to grow. "Not tomorrow or in an hour after I've adjusted, but right now while I still have the courage to believe this might actually work." She wiped her face with the back of her hand, a gesture impatient with her own emotions. Grace understood the impulse even as her engineer's caution urged slower progression, but she also recognized that Victoria had spent 4 years being careful and graduated, and that sometimes courage required jumping rather than stepping. 5 steps, she said, establishing a boundary that acknowledged both Victoria's need and Grace's responsibility. Slow and deliberate, focusing on how each foot feels from heel strike through toe off, and if anything feels wrong, we stop immediately. Victoria nodded acceptance of these terms and took a breath that seemed to fill her entire body, preparing for a moment that would either validate or destroy the hope that had been building over 2 weeks of watching Grace work. Her right foot lifted first, the modified ankle flexing through its range to bring her foot forward, and Grace saw the exact instant when Victoria registered that the movement felt natural rather than compensatory. The foot descended, heel contacted the floor, and her weight rolled forward through a toe-off that the original equipment would have forced into awkward compensation. The left foot followed with less hesitation, Victoria's confidence building with each successful element of the gait cycle, and suddenly she was walking with a fluidity that made the previous week's right-side-only improvement look preliminary by comparison. Both ankles worked in concert now, distributing force and adapting to her natural movement patterns, rather than imposing external constraints. Grace tracked her across the garage floor, noting how Victoria's posture was already shifting, her hips leveling, and her spine straightening as compensation patterns unwound. By the third step, Victoria's face had transformed into an expression Grace had never seen from her before, joy so pure and uncomplicated, it seemed to make her younger, stripping away the careful control she'd maintained throughout their interactions. The fourth step came with a laugh that sounded surprised by its own existence, and the fifth step carried her into a pivot that let her turn and face Grace with eyes that held wonder mixed with disbelief. "They work," Victoria said unnecessarily, stating the obvious because sometimes reality needed verbal confirmation before the mind would accept it. Grace felt her own eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall, maintaining professional composure through sheer will, even as her chest tightened with the particular satisfaction of having solved a problem that mattered beyond mechanical function. "They work," she confirmed, her voice rougher than intended. "How do they feel compared to what you've been experiencing? Be specific about any discomfort or unexpected sensations so we can address them." "Everything feels wrong because nothing hurts," Victoria said, the paradoxical statement perfectly capturing the cognitive adjustment required when baseline expectations got fundamentally altered. "My brain keeps sending warnings about pain that should be happening at each step, but the signals aren't arriving, so there's this strange disconnect between anticipation and reality." She took 3 more steps, experimenting with different speeds and weight distributions. "My lower back feels loose in a way I'd forgotten was possible. Like tension I didn't even know I was carrying is just dissolving." The technical assessment was exactly what Grace needed, confirming that the modifications were functioning as designed while revealing secondary effects that validated her biomechanical analysis. "That's the compensation cascade unwinding," she explained, watching Victoria continue to explore her new range of movement. "Your back was constantly tensing to stabilize the instability your ankles were creating, and now that foundation is solid, your body doesn't need to maintain that defensive pattern." Victoria walked the garage's length 3 more times, each circuit showing more confidence and less conscious thought, as her nervous system began accepting this new reality as normal rather than temporary miracle. Her gait was approaching symmetrical, both sides working together rather than one compensating for the other's limitations. Grace documented everything with her phone's camera, creating record of this first sustained walk that they could analyze later for any subtle issues that might not be immediately apparent. Marco had been maintaining his post near the entrance with professional invisibility, but Grace noticed his hand move to his phone moments before the black SUV appeared at the curb. Matteo must have been nearby, waiting for the call that indicated readiness, because his arrival came too quickly to have traveled from any distance. He emerged from the vehicle already in motion, his controlled composure visibly straining against whatever emotions were demanding expression beneath the surface. He stopped in the garage entrance, framed by the doorway's rectangle of sunlight that made him a silhouette for a moment, before his eyes adjusted to the interior lighting. Grace watched his gaze find Victoria, who was mid-stride across the workshop, watched him process what he was seeing with the particular stillness that preceded major emotional breaches. His hand rose to his chest, fingers spreading over his heart, as if he could physically contain whatever was expanding inside his ribcage. Victoria completed her walk and turned to face her father, and Grace saw something pass between them that needed no words, a communication built on years of shared struggle and disappointed hopes that made this moment's reality almost impossible to accept. "Hi, Dad," Victoria said simply, the casual greeting incongruous against the magnitude of what she was demonstrating just by standing there balanced and pain-free. Grace finished the modifications. Matteo tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing twice before any sound emerged, and when it finally did, his voice had been stripped of every bit of careful control that usually characterized it. "Show me," he managed, the request emerging as something between command and plea, and Grace heard the breaking happening in real time behind those two words. His hands had begun trembling, visible even from across the garage, body betraying emotions his face was still trying to contain. Victoria walked toward her father with steps that demonstrated the modification's success more effectively than any technical explanation could, her gait showing the natural rhythm that had been absent for years. Mateo's eyes tracked every movement with intensity that went beyond attention into territory of memorization, as if he was burning this moment into permanent memory against the possibility it might somehow be taken away. His jaw worked soundlessly, throat moving with swallows that suggested he was fighting back the full force of his reaction. She stopped 3 feet from him, close enough that he could see the new ease in her posture, the absence of the micro-grimaces that pain had etched into her habitual expressions. "It doesn't hurt," Victoria told him, articulating the simple fact that medical specialists with prestigious credentials and expensive facilities had never managed to deliver. "I can walk without fighting the equipment, without calculating every step around where the pain will spike, without ending each day feeling like my body is being punished for trying to move." The first tear broke past Mateo's control and tracked down his cheek, followed immediately by another, and then his face simply crumpled as years of contained fear and helplessness found release. His daughter had been suffering, and his power and money had been useless against her pain, and watching her walk freely was apparently more than his defensive walls could withstand. He closed the distance between them, and pulled Victoria into an embrace that looked almost desperate, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd probably been holding back through countless medical consultations and failed treatments. Victoria held her father with arms that understood this breakdown was necessary rather than uncomfortable, letting him process the relief of witnessing her transformation without trying to minimize or redirect his emotions. Grace looked away to give them privacy, focusing her attention on organizing tools that didn't need organizing, but she could still hear Mateo's ragged breathing and the Italian words he was murmuring into Victoria's hair that probably translated to prayers or thanks. The moment stretched for perhaps 2 minutes before his breathing steadied, and he pulled back enough to look at his daughter's face again. "Forgive me," Mateo said, wiping his face with hands that were still visibly shaking, speaking to Victoria but including Grace in his field of vision. "I brought you to the best specialists, the most expensive facilities, and they all failed you while I stood by believing that credentials and cost must equal competence." His voice carried bitterness directed entirely at himself. "I watched you suffer for years, and my power meant nothing because I was asking the wrong people for help." "You didn't know," Victoria said gently, but Mateo shook his head sharply, rejecting the offered absolution with the particular stubbornness of someone determined to fully acknowledge their failures. He turned to face Grace directly, and she saw him struggling to find words adequate to a situation his usual frameworks couldn't process. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, that automatic gesture she'd seen before, but stopped halfway as if he'd remembered this wasn't a transaction that money could properly address. "What do I owe you?" Mateo asked, the question emerging as something more complex than simple inquiry about payment, carrying undertones about debts that transcended financial calculation. "Not just for the modifications, but for giving my daughter back her life in ways I'd stopped believing were possible." His eyes held hers with uncomfortable intensity, demanding answer that satisfied more than procedural requirements. "Name anything within my power to provide, and consider it yours." Grace felt the weight of the offer, understanding that Mateo was someone whose power extended into territories she could only partially imagine, and that saying anything wasn't hyperbole from someone in his position. The temptation to ask for things she'd never be able to afford otherwise pulled at her, but accepting would fundamentally alter the nature of what she'd accomplished. And why? "I charged $300 for the materials I used, and my normal shop rate of $75 per hour for the time invested," she said, naming figures that were fair for her work, but absurdly low for what had been achieved. Mateo stared at her as if she'd spoken in a language he didn't understand, his expression cycling through confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been offense. "That's perhaps $2,000 total for work that gave Victoria mobility that orthopedic specialists charging $50,000 per device failed to provide," he said, voice sharp with the particular frustration of someone encountering irrationality in a form he couldn't correct. "You're either insulting what you've accomplished or insulting my ability to recognize appropriate compensation." "I'm charging what I charge," Grace replied, meeting his intensity without backing down despite the clear power differential between them. "Your daughter's improvement is the compensation that matters, and taking money beyond my standard rates would make this about profit rather than solving a problem that needed solving." She paused, making sure he was fully listening. If you want to do something meaningful with your gratitude, find other people who need help that conventional systems are failing, and make sure they can access someone willing to approach their problems from new angles. The suggestion landed differently than Grace expected, Mateo's expression shifting into something calculating as his business mind apparently engaged with the concept of systematic intervention, rather than individual transaction. You're suggesting I fund a pipeline for people like Victoria, who fall outside what standard medical approaches can accommodate, he said slowly, processing implications and possibilities. Using the model you've demonstrated here, finding capable people who work outside conventional credentialing systems and connecting them with patients, the system has failed. I'm suggesting you use your resources to make unconventional solutions accessible to people who don't have wealthy fathers to pay my shop rate 20 times over if necessary, Grace clarified, recognizing that Mateo was already building something larger than she'd intended in his mind. What happened here worked because I could afford to spend 2 weeks focused on Victoria's specific needs without worrying about paying rent. But most mechanics can't do that, and most patients can't wait while someone figures out their particular puzzle. Victoria had been watching this exchange with an expression that suggested she was seeing her father from a new angle, observing him genuinely struggle with someone who wouldn't be moved by money or intimidated by power. Grace is right, she said quietly, entering the conversation with authority her father couldn't easily dismiss. The specialists failed me partly because they were trying to apply scalable solutions to a problem that needed individualized attention, and that only works economically if someone subsidizes the time required for true customization. Mateo looked between his daughter and Grace, clearly unused to being in situations where he wasn't the person defining terms, and Grace saw the moment something fundamental shifted in how he was processing this interaction. "I'll write a check for the amount you specified," he said, the words emerging with visible effort as he forced himself to respect Grace's boundaries even when they violated his instincts. "And I'll establish a foundation that funds work like yours, connecting skilled people operating outside traditional systems with patients who need exactly that kind of unconventional thinking." "The foundation should be Victoria's project," Grace said, seeing an opportunity to push the transformation further. She understands both sides now, the patient experience and the technical requirements, which makes her better qualified than anyone to identify who needs help and who can actually provide it. She looked at Victoria directly. "You've been documenting my process in your notebook, analyzing the biomechanics, connecting theory to practice in ways your computer science degree prepared you for, so you know what questions to ask and what bullshit to reject." Victoria's eyes widened as she processed the suggestion, Grace's confidence in her capability apparently unexpected, but clearly resonant with something she'd been feeling without articulating. "I'd need to learn more about orthotic engineering, biomechanics, materials science," she said, the statement emerging as thought process rather than objection. "But I could do that while building the framework for identifying patients and matching them with people who approach problems the way Grace does, prioritizing function over credentials." "You'd be remarkable at it," Grace said with certainty, recognizing the particular kind of intelligence that combined analytical thinking with lived experience in ways that purely academic or purely practical people couldn't match. "You've spent years being the person conventional systems failed, and now you're developing the technical knowledge to understand why they failed, which makes you perfectly positioned to build something better." She paused. "And you'd be doing it from inside your father's world, using his resources and connections to create access that people like me could never generate alone." Mateo watched his daughter's expression transform as she considered the possibility, saw the shift from recipient of help to architect of systematic change, and Grace observed him processing what this meant for Victoria's future. His daughter wouldn't just recover from her limitations. She'd transform that experience into purpose that extended beyond herself. "The foundation would need proper structure," he said, his business instincts engaging now that the conversation had moved into territory he understood. "Legal framework, vetting processes, outcome metrics that ensure we're actually solving problems, rather than just redistributing resources to charismatic failures. I can help design the technical evaluation criteria," Grace offered, recognizing that Mateo's insistence on structure wasn't about control, but about effectiveness, ensuring that good intentions translated into actual results. "I know what questions separate people who can truly innovate from people who just think conventionally, but with different tools." She glanced at Victoria. "And she'll know what questions patients need answered before trusting someone with their bodies and hopes, because she's been on that side of the equation." The three of them stood in the garage that had become something beyond a simple repair shop. The space transformed into origin point for something that would extend far beyond Victoria's individual healing. Mateo's tears had dried, but his face still carried the openness that emotional breakthrough had created, his usual masks temporarily abandoned. Victoria stood balanced on modifications that represented both technical achievement and philosophical approach that challenged conventional wisdom about where expertise resided and how problems got solved. Word spread through channels Grace didn't fully understand. Patients appearing at her garage with stories of failed treatments, and specialists who'd stopped returning their calls. The first was a construction worker whose knee brace created more problems than it solved, prescribed by orthopedists who'd never asked what movements his actual job required. Grace modified the hinge mechanism using principles she'd developed for Victoria, and he returned 2 weeks later with a job foreman who had similar issues with ankle support that prevented him from climbing scaffolding safely. Mateo's foundation took shape with surprising speed, Victoria transforming from patient to administrator, with the particular intensity of someone who'd found purpose that aligned perfectly with capability. She'd converted a notebook habit into a comprehensive database that tracked patient needs, available craftspeople, and outcome metrics that measured success through functional improvement rather than compliance with medical standards. Her computer science background made her unnaturally good at identifying patterns across cases that seemed unrelated on surface examination. Grace found herself training other mechanics and metal workers who had the technical skills, but lacked framework for translating automotive or sculptural expertise into medical applications. She'd developed teaching methodology that emphasized observation over assumption, showing them how to document movement patterns and identify where equipment failed to accommodate human reality. The approach felt natural to people who'd spent careers solving problems through hands-on experimentation rather than theoretical modeling. The garage had become too small for the volume of work arriving, but Grace resisted Mateo's offers to relocate her into proper facility with staff and equipment budgets that made her current setup look like child's play. Something essential would be lost in translation to institutional setting, the intimacy and focus that came from working in space where every tool had history and purpose. Instead, she accepted funding for 2 shipping containers converted into additional workspace that preserved the garage's essential character while expanding capacity. Victoria visited weekly now rather than daily, her university schedule consuming time that had previously been spent watching Grace work, but their relationship had evolved beyond teacher-student into something more collaborative. She'd bring cases from the Foundation's intake process that seemed particularly challenging, presenting them like puzzles she knew Grace would find interesting. "This one's a pianist whose hand braces prevent the finger independence she needs for complex pieces," Victoria said during one visit, spreading medical records and photographs across Grace's workbench with the casual confidence of someone who belonged in this space. Grace examined the documentation with growing interest, her mind already translating the problem into mechanical terms she understood about leverage and range of motion. The braces were designed to stabilize joints affected by early arthritis, but they'd been built with typing or daily living activities in mind, rather than the extreme precision and speed that piano performance demanded. "I'd need to see her play," Grace said, recognizing that this problem required understanding the specific movements that current equipment prevented, rather than just analyzing the devices themselves. The Foundation arranged for a piano to be delivered to one of Grace's converted containers, transforming the space temporarily into something between workshop and concert hall. The pianist arrived looking skeptical, her braced hands held carefully as if they were fragile objects rather than parts of her body, and Grace spent an hour just watching her attempt to play pieces that her muscle memory knew, but her equipment wouldn't allow. The frustration was visible in every aborted run, every passage that broke down when her fingers couldn't move independently enough to execute what her brain commanded. Grace recorded everything from multiple angles, then spent 3 days fabricating new braces that used principles borrowed from bicycle cable housing and guitar string mechanisms to allow finger independence while still providing the joint stability that prevented pain. The modification required precision measuring in fractions of millimeters, each finger needing slightly different solutions based on how that particular pianist used it during performance. When the musician tried the new braces and successfully completed a Chopin etude she hadn't been able to play in 2 years, she cried in a way that reminded Grace of Victoria's first successful steps. Mateo had stepped back from daily involvement in the Foundation once it became clear Victoria had both the competence and passion to run it effectively, but he maintained presence through strategic interventions that opened doors his daughter couldn't access alone. He'd connected the foundation with medical schools whose students needed exposure to approaches that challenged conventional orthodoxy, creating a pipeline of young doctors who understood that expertise could exist outside credentialed systems. His reputation in certain circles, which Grace had initially found ominous, apparently translated into ability to have conversations with institutional leaders that resulted in actual policy changes. The transformation in Matteo himself was perhaps as significant as anything the Foundation accomplished through its direct work. He'd redirected portions of his business empire's resources toward manufacturing equipment designed using principles the Foundation's work had validated, creating products that prioritized individual customization over mass production efficiency. His board meetings now included presentations from patients and craftspeople rather than just financial analysts, a cultural shift that his associates apparently found both baffling and somehow inevitable, given the intensity Matteo brought to anything involving his daughter's well-being. Grace maintained boundaries around her time and energy that Matteo's money couldn't breach, continuing to accept only cases that genuinely interested her and refusing to scale her operation beyond what she could personally oversee. The Foundation respected these limits while creating a network of other craftspeople who could handle volume Grace couldn't accommodate, each one vetted through processes Victoria had designed to identify genuine capability versus credentialed incompetence. The model proved sustainable in ways that surprised healthcare economists who'd assumed individualized approaches couldn't work at scale. Victoria graduated with her computer science degree and immediately enrolled in biomedical engineering master's program. Her dissertation proposal focused on developing assessment frameworks that identified when standard medical devices failed individual patients. She'd become minor celebrity in certain academic circles, invited to present at conferences where her lived experience as patient combined with technical knowledge made her uniquely credible. Grace attended one such presentation and watched Victoria command a room full of doctors and engineers with the quiet authority of someone who'd earned expertise through suffering and subsequent transformation rather than merely studying it. The Foundation's first annual report documented 300 successful interventions across 15 different craftspeople, with outcome metrics showing functional improvements that exceeded what conventional medical approaches had achieved for the same patient populations. Matteo had framed the report and hung it in his office, Victoria told Grace, positioned where he'd see it first thing every morning as reminder of what became possible when power served purpose beyond accumulation. The man who'd arrived at Grace's garage, desperate and controlling, had apparently discovered that influence wielded on behalf of others produced satisfaction his previous pursuits had never delivered. Grace's garage remained fundamentally unchanged despite the shipping containers and increased traffic, still recognizable as the space where someone could bring a broken car or a broken body and receive the same quality of diagnostic attention. She'd hired one assistant, a young woman who'd dropped out of engineering school because professors couldn't understand why she wanted to work with her hands instead of pursuing research positions. The assistant learned quickly, demonstrating the particular intelligence that combined theoretical understanding with practical intuition in ways formal education often failed to develop. A medical journal contacted Grace, requesting an interview about her methodology, and she initially declined before Victoria convinced her that documentation served purposes beyond personal recognition. The article focused on questions about where expertise resided and how medical systems could accommodate approaches challenging conventional hierarchy. Response from medical establishments was mixed. Some practitioners intrigued, while others dismissed the work as anecdotal success. Patients read the article differently, seeing validation of experiences they'd been told were impossible when standard treatments failed them. The Foundation's intake requests tripled within a month, overwhelming Victoria's triage systems, until she hired staff for initial assessments. Grace spent one day weekly consulting remotely, using video calls to observe movement patterns and suggest approaches. An orthopedic conference invited Grace to present, offering speaking fee exceeding her typical monthly income. The presentation hall held 300 doctors, engineers, and researchers, expecting either revolutionary technique or dismissible charlatan. Grace showed videos of Victoria's first steps, the pianist's Chopin etude, the construction worker returning to scaffolding. The question session revealed the chasm between Grace's approach and conventional medical thinking. "You're essentially practicing medicine without a license," one surgeon said, hovering between accusation and confusion. Grace had anticipated this and prepared response that Victoria helped refine. "I'm practicing mechanical engineering on devices that interface with human bodies," Grace replied calmly. "I'm not diagnosing or prescribing. I'm observing how equipment fails to accommodate the specific human using it. She paused. If modifying a brace requires medical license, so should manufacturing one. The logic caught her questioner off balance, and several audience members nodded. Another hand rose, belonging to younger doctor whose body language suggested genuine curiosity. How do you determine when a problem exceeds your capability? She asked. Grace appreciated the nuance, recognizing someone who understood defending alternatives didn't require rejecting all conventional wisdom. I start by asking what existing equipment should accomplish, and whether it's actually accomplishing that for this specific person. She pulled up a slide showing her assessment checklist. The presentation's reception was positive enough that 2 medical schools invited Grace to conduct workshops for students. She accepted on condition Victoria co-teach, recognizing her perspective as patient and administrator, provided context Grace couldn't deliver alone. The workshops became annual events, gradually shifting how some students thought about treatment protocols. Matteo attended from the back row where he thought he was inconspicuous, though his suit and Marco's presence marked him as different. He approached afterward with expression Grace read, as pride mixed with recognition. You made them uncomfortable in exactly the right ways, he said quietly. Victoria watched from the front row, recording on her laptop while tracking social media responses. You're trending in orthopedic circles, she told Grace afterward, showing debate about credentialing versus competence filling her phone screen. Some hate what you represent, but smart ones are asking right questions. The Foundation's work attracted healthcare policy researchers interested in cost-effectiveness analyses comparing individualized craft interventions to standard medical device prescriptions. Preliminary data suggested Grace's approach, despite requiring more time per patient, actually cost less overall when accounting for failed treatments. Matteo quietly funded the research through channels keeping his involvement invisible. Grace returned to Chicago and her garage with relief, the conference experience valuable but exhausting. She'd been away 3 days, and her workbench had accumulated projects pulling her attention back into practical work. A teenager's arm brace needed adjustment, an elderly man's walker required modification, and someone had dropped off leg prosthetic. The prosthetic represented new territory since Grace had primarily worked with braces and orthoses rather than replacement limbs, but mechanical principles looked familiar enough for confident attempt. She photographed it and sent images to Victoria with questions about prosthetic expertise in the Foundation's network. Within an hour, Victoria had connected her with Seattle prosthetist, experimenting with similar customization approaches. They spent 2 weeks exchanging designs remotely, building prototype that combined both their expertise. The patient who'd dropped off the original prosthetic returned for fitting and walked out with improved gait. Grace added the prosthetist to her informal network of specialists she could consult when cases exceeded her individual expertise. This collaborative approach became foundation principle that Victoria formalized into consultation protocols, ensuring craftspeople could access expertise without compromising individualized attention. The network grew organically, specialists recommending others whose approaches aligned with Foundation's philosophy. 2 years after Victoria's first steps with modified orthoses, Grace received a call from a journalist working on documentary about healthcare innovation and wanted to feature the Foundation's work. She'd declined similar requests before, protective of her privacy, and skeptical of media's tendency to sensationalize or simplify complex stories. But this journalist had spent months researching and demonstrated understanding that went beyond surface-level inspiration narratives. Grace agreed on condition that Victoria be central to the story rather than herself, recognizing that her role was ultimately just catalyst for transformation that extended far beyond one mechanic's garage. The documentary crew spent a week filming at the garage, capturing Grace's process with patient who'd been living with poorly fitted back brace that created more problems than it solved. They recorded assessment, fabrication, testing, and final fitting across multiple days, showing the methodical care that separated effective modification from hopeful tinkering. The patient's relief when the adjusted brace actually supported her spine without creating pressure points made for powerful footage that required no dramatic narration to convey its significance. Victoria's segments were filmed at the Foundation's modest office, where she walked viewers through the database systems she'd built for tracking patients and craftspeople, explaining the vetting process that separated capable innovators from well-meaning amateurs. She spoke about her own experience with clinical detachment, until the interviewer asked her to describe her first steps with Grace's modifications, and suddenly the professional distance dissolved into raw emotion that made clear this work was personal before it became systematic. Grace gave me my body back, Victoria said simply, tears streaming down her face despite obvious effort at composure. And now we're trying to do that for everyone the system has failed. Matteo's interview happened in his office, surrounded by evidence of legitimate business empire that the documentary was careful to present, without emphasizing the less conventional aspects of his influence. He spoke about watching his daughter suffer while specialists failed her, about the helplessness of having resources that couldn't solve the problem that mattered most. "I thought I understood power," he said, voice thick with emotion that 2 years hadn't diminished. "But power means nothing when your child is in pain and you can't fix it." He paused, composing himself. "Grace taught me that sometimes the solution comes from the last place you'd think to look, from someone working in a garage who doesn't have credentials but has something more important, the ability to see what's actually wrong rather than what textbooks say should be wrong." The documentary premiered at a film festival focused on healthcare and social justice, winning awards that translated into distribution deals, ensuring wider audience than Grace had anticipated. She attended the premiere reluctantly, sitting between Victoria and Matteo in theater, filled with medical professionals, patients, and activists, who gave standing ovation when the credits rolled. The applause felt excessive to Grace, who still saw herself as mechanic who'd solved problems using skills she'd always had, but she understood the ovation was for what the story represented about challenging systems that claimed exclusive expertise. The film's release coincided with legislative discussions about medical device regulation and whether modification of prescribed equipment should require medical oversight or could be performed by qualified craftspeople under appropriate frameworks. Victoria testified before a state committee considering the question, presenting data from the Foundation's 2 years of operation, showing safety records that matched or exceeded conventional medical device success rates. Her testimony, combined with patients sharing stories of being failed by standard approaches, proved persuasive enough that the committee recommended pilot program allowing licensed craftspeople to perform equipment modifications under physician supervision. Grace's Garage became destination for medical students doing rotations focused on understanding how patients experience their prescribed equipment in daily life rather than controlled clinical settings. She'd adapted to the teaching role with same pragmatic competence she brought to everything, showing students how to observe rather than assume, and how to distinguish between problems that needed medical intervention and those requiring mechanical solutions. One student's reflection paper noted that watching Grace assess a patient taught him more about diagnosis than his entire third-year coursework had, a comment that got circulated among faculty who were trying to reform medical education. Matteo's business empire had quietly become major manufacturer of customizable medical equipment, using principles the Foundation's work had validated to create devices that could be adjusted for individual patients, rather than forcing bodies to accommodate standardized designs. The products cost marginally more to produce but generated fewer returns and warranty claims because they actually worked for the people using them. His board had resisted initially, arguing that customization didn't scale efficiently, but profitability data eventually convinced them that solving problems correctly the first time was better business than generating repeat customers through chronic failure. Victoria's master's thesis became a published book that medical and engineering schools assigned to students learning about patient-centered design and the limitations of standardized solutions. She dedicated it to Grace, with inscription that read, "For the mechanic who saw what doctors missed, and who taught me that expertise lives in unexpected places." Grace kept a copy on her workbench, occasionally opening it when patients asked how she'd learned to do this work, showing them that sometimes the best validation comes from the people whose lives you've changed, rather than institutions granting credentials. The Foundation had expanded to cover 17 states, with a network of 43 craftspeople who'd been vetted through Victoria's rigorous assessment process and trained in documentation methods that allowed outcome tracking across the distributed network. Each craftsperson maintained their independence and individual approach while contributing to collective knowledge base that grew with every case. Grace reviewed difficult cases monthly via video conference, offering guidance that drew on her expanding experience with how mechanical principles applied across different types of equipment and conditions. A major medical journal published a study comparing outcomes for patients who'd received Foundation interventions versus those treated through conventional medical device channels, finding that the Foundation's approach produced superior functional improvements at lower overall cost, despite requiring more individualized attention per case. The study's authors were careful to note that the Foundation's success depended on rigorous vetting of craftspeople and couldn't be replicated by simply allowing anyone to modify medical equipment. But the data challenged assumptions about whether standardization necessarily served patients better than customization. Grace had modified her garage's sign to include orthotic modifications below the original auto repair text, acknowledging that her business had evolved while maintaining roots in mechanical work that paid most of her bills. She still preferred working on cars because engines didn't carry emotional weight of human suffering, but she'd accepted that her skills served purposes beyond what she'd originally imagined. The variety kept the work interesting, her mind shifting between automotive and biomedical problems with the same diagnostic framework applying to both. Victoria stopped by on a Tuesday afternoon without appointment, something she rarely did anymore given her schedule running the foundation and pursuing doctorate in biomedical engineering. She was walking with a smoothness that still occasionally surprised Grace despite 2 years of evidence that the modifications had produced lasting improvement rather than temporary relief. "I have news," Victoria said, settling onto the stool that was still designated as hers. "The prosthetic company in Seattle wants to license the ankle joint design you developed for collaborative project, and they're offering licensing fee that would let you work exclusively on cases that interest you, rather than having to take every job that comes in for financial reasons." Grace set down the wrench she'd been holding and gave Victoria her full attention, recognizing that this offer represented a decision point about what direction her work would take. Licensing the design meant releasing control over how it got used, trusting that the company would maintain the individualization principles that made it effective, rather than mass-producing something that lost essential character in translation to scale. But it also meant the design could help people she'd never meet in places she'd never go, extending impact beyond what her hands could accomplish alone. "What do you think I should do?" Grace asked, genuinely uncertain despite her usual confidence in her own judgment, recognizing that Victoria understood dimensions of this decision that extended beyond Grace's primary concerns. Victoria smiled, the expression carrying awareness that their roles had reversed from when she'd first arrived seeking help for her own situation. "I think you should do whatever lets you keep doing the work you love, while knowing you've contributed to helping people at scale," Victoria replied. "The design is brilliant, and it deserves to reach more people than you can personally serve, but only if the company commits to customization principles rather than treating it as another standardized product." She paused. "I can negotiate terms that protect the design's integrity, while ensuring you maintain creative control over applications, if you trust me to advocate for what matters most." Grace nodded slowly, recognizing that Victoria had developed expertise that complemented her own, creating partnership that was more effective than either of them could be working independently. "Draft the terms you think protect what matters," she said, returning trust that Victoria had placed in her 2 years ago when she'd agreed to let a mechanic with no credentials modify medical equipment her father's money had bought from prestigious specialists. The symmetry felt appropriate, their relationship having evolved from patient-practitioner to something more complex and mutually transformative. Thank you all for following this story. If you've connected with Grace and Victoria's journey, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support matters and helps us continue bringing you stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things through skill, compassion, and the courage to challenge systems that claim exclusive expertise. These stories exist because you believe, as we do, that transformation can come from unexpected places when we're willing to look beyond credentials and recognize true capability wherever it resides.